Hello. This small lecture will be about the work of Indian scholar THUSSU. He does work on media economics, which has a lot of similarity to Bob McChesney's work, and he also provides us with a critique of news coverage. I first provide you with two tables that THUSSU has put together. Unlike McChesney, he identifies 6 major players who are part of the global oligopoly. He's got who McChesney has. He's got Time Warner and Disney and News Corp. But he also adds Sony, Bertelsmann, and Viacom. Bertelsmann is an interesting addition. It's a huge German publishing house. Owns many magazines, also many bookstores. You'll recognize some of the titles. Random House, Knopf, Crown USA. Sony is another interesting addition. THUSSU includes them because not only there are many media products which we often use, but they're a huge producer of video games. Viacom is another interesting addition. Besides their TV stations such as CBS and UPN, they also own MTV, Nickelodeon, VH1, along with a lot of other magazines and television stations. But there is no escaping the Holy Trinity, as McChesney says, of Time Warner, Disney, and News Corp. The second set of tables I gave you breaks down the holdings of News Corp and Disney, perhaps the 2 largest media conglomerates in the world. I want you to get a sense of their many, many holdings. If you just take a look, for example, at the television stations that News Corp owns. Of course, it starts with Fox, but there are local Fox stations in almost every big city in America. Similarly, take a look at the radio stations owned by Walt Disney Company. Every big city in America has a Disney-owned station. Is it any wonder that you've heard Hannah Montana songs on those stations for years? Truly, those tables show the nature of vertical integration. Let's take up the second set of readings by THUSSU, his book chapter called Media Plenty and the Poverty of News. His overall point is really interesting. We've probably never had a time where we've had more media, and yet the amount of news we get from around the world is minuscule. THUSSU puts a really interesting emphasis on what he calls the global south, where the majority of human beings live in development. India, Africa, Latin America, Indonesia, parts of Asia. We see little of this in our northern news, and yet here is where much of the world's news should be coming from. He really offers 2 critiques. Poverty of the news, by which he means that news coverage is really impoverished. It's thin, it's loaded with celebrities and sensationalism, and very little about the developing world. And then poverty in the news. He selects as his case study, how does news look at poverty? And of course, we know the answer. It really doesn't. It would much rather cover celebrities and sensational events and dramas and war, and poverty, which is slow and unfolding over time, rarely makes it into the news. And so his title has a really interesting double meaning, poverty of and in the news. He reminds us we are in an era of amazing media plenty. CNN, MSNBC, the BBC, Fox, 24-hour news channels. And yet with 24-hour news, we still get very little coverage of the developing world. Like McChesney, THUSSU places special emphasis on Rupert Murdoch, but not necessarily for his Fox News, which we're very familiar with in the United States. Murdoch also has a satellite channel called Sky News, which shows up in Asia, Europe, Africa, reaches billions of people. And of course, you can imagine the content on that. It's the same thing that McChesney talked about. Mass-produced, nothing political, anything to reach the masses. I was very pleased to see THUSSU mention Al Jazeera. It's often known as the CNN of the Arab world. It's got a bad reputation in the United States because it was trusted by many in the Arab world, including Al-Qaeda. Bin Laden would give videotapes to Al Jazeera to play. But Al Jazeera always said its role was just to be an objective reporter of world events. It would take material from Bin Laden. It would take material from the United States. It's become a major player in most parts of the world. It is just starting to find a foothold in the United States on cable. THUSSU then gives us a little bit of history. You might think that the global South would be upset about its portrayal in Western news media, and it turns out to be the case. In the 1970s and 1980s, countries from the global South came to the United Nations and UNESCO, and they pressed for what they called the New World Information and Communication Order, NWICO. What those countries wanted was for the Western northern countries to press upon their news agencies to cover the global South more and to cover it better, not just wars and assassinations and earthquakes. The northern and western countries responded that they couldn't control their country's news media because of things like First Amendment freedoms and freedom of the press. It was a very contentious struggle through the 70s and the 80s. At the center of this controversy, even till today, is the Associated Press, known mostly as the AP. The AP is a wire service agency. That's something different than being a newspaper or television station. It's actually a cooperative among those television stations and newspapers. The cooperative means that all those different stations, newspapers, magazines chip in a little bit of money so that the Associated Press can cover parts of the world that the individual newspapers and TV stations couldn't cover by themselves. It's very expensive, for example, to keep a reporter in Cairo. But if you've got 100 newspapers and TV stations funding an Associated Press reporter, the costs go down. So if you study the bylines of stories from around the world, and including the United States, you'll often see a parenthesis with AP on it. It could be sports stories, it could be politics, it could be global stories. Very often the AP is reporting the news. So the AP has always had a large role to play in international reporting, but even more so nowadays. In times of cutbacks, when newspapers, television stations, magazines are cutting their foreign bureaus, sometimes the only northern and western reporters in an area are from the Associated Press. THUSSU has a couple of really interesting lines. He talks about the unreported world, the parts of the world that receive very little, if any, news coverage. And he has a sentence right after that that says, the absences from the foreign news agenda are staggering. It will come as no surprise to you that one of the areas of the world that he says receives very little coverage is Africa. It's pretty ironic when we think about what we were talking about a few weeks ago, that the bottom billion lives in Africa. So here's the part of the world that's most challenged, getting the least reporting. As just one example, he talks about reporting about coltan. That's a mineral we have talked about before. It's the conductor that's in all of our cell phones. It's a mineral that happens to be pretty rich in Africa, especially the Congo. So entire countries in Africa are torn apart as drug gangs fight over the rights to these minerals. The cell phone companies likely could do something about it, but it's much easier for them not to. They just need the coltan. The other major example of the unreported world, of course, is poverty in the news. He talks about how poverty is not covered. He gives a couple of reasons for that. They're very related to what McChesney was talking about in terms of the global oligopoly and its effect on media content. THUSSU says that the commercialization and privatization of news makes news media look for content that has a kind of sexy or sensational or dramatic content. A second and related reason is that news about such intense poverty is inherently political. People would have to wonder, what is there about our system that 1 billion people are still living in such poverty while others are so rich? That is a question, of course, that the global media oligopoly doesn't want to ask. THUSSU talks about the way Western foundations and journalism organizations tried to help the Global South by developing notions of development communication or development journalism. The idea was to help the Global South develop their own journalism. But we often find that the journalists in developing countries work under much different circumstances. And in fact, oftentimes their lives can be threatened, and some journalists, many journalists, have been killed trying to do their reporting in the Global South. THUSSU puts a phrase at the end of his chapter that I wanted us to think about: the global digital divide. The digital divide really refers to the division between those who have technology and digital products and those who don't. Oftentimes we think that the future of the world should be somewhat optimistic and that people can get onto social media and have political and social discussions and change their lives and inform themselves through the internet, until we realize they don't get the internet. They don't have access to these sorts of things. Thanks very much for viewing this video. I hope you have come away with some appreciation for our time of media plenty and the poverty of news.